Thanks so much for joining me today. This is Kathy, and I am excited to share another card using the Arteza Real Brush Markers. And as per my first video using them, here's my disclaimer. I am not a watercolorist, but I've really enjoyed using these brush pen markers. They are so easy to use, and I have been practicing with them a lot. So for this card, I started out by stamping some of the succulents from the Succulent Sparkle stamp set by Trinity Stamps. I stamped them onto a piece of Canson watercolor cardstock, and I used cement gray hybrid ink from My Favorite Things. So the colors that I used, I'll list them down in the description below. I can't say that I can tell you how to use these. Because again, not a watercolorist. I was just playing around and I was really happy with the results that I got with these particular stamps and colors that I used. I will tell you what I did, but I probably have some really bad habits, so I don't want to say this is how you do it. One of the things that I've really been practicing on trying to gain control of is how much water I use, because I'm very heavy-handed with it. So for these images, I applied the brush pen directly to an acrylic block and then used a damp paintbrush. It's not really sopping wet, but there's definitely water held in the bristles of the brush. And I started out with the light green and just did a quick coat of that color all over all three of the succulents. I'm only going to show how I colored two of them in this video. Because the third one is the same shape, or the third one is the same stamp as the second one, and I didn't want to take up too much of your time because this is already a pretty long video for me. Anyway, back to the coloring. I wanted to add some of that teal-y turquoise color that you see with the succulents, and I know that most of the time succulents are kind of a muted color, but I really wanted mine to pop up and be nice and bright. So the second color I used is teal, and again, everything will be listed in the description below. And with the teal, I didn't want it to be too bright, so I also added that to the acrylic block and then picked it up with the brush and kind of just went in the areas where it might be a little bit darker. This first succulent there, and I don't know the names of these things either. My sister would. She loved succulents. She had a beautiful succulent garden. I, on the other hand, I do not have a green thumb. I can kill a silk plant if I look at it too long, so I just went off on a major tangent. So back to the succulent. The second color I used was teal, and I just added a tiny little bit of it and then kind of mixed in a little bit more green. And again, I'm just playing with these things, so I can't tell you how to do it. I can show you what I did and tell you the colors I used, but there was no method to my madness. The one thing that I really did like was using the cement gray ink. The color from the brush pen markers kind of overtook the lines of the stamp. It kind of masked the gray, so I'm not going to call this necessarily no line coloring, but it kind of ended up looking sort of no line coloring-ish. After I was done with the first succulent and I moved on to the second one, I decided to go in directly with the brush marker to add in darker areas where one petal is on top of the other, because the petal on top would be casting a shadow on the petal that's underneath it. I'm trying to get some layering look or some dimensional look. And I knew that if I used the ink that was on the acrylic block, that might be a little bit too muted. So that's why I went in direct with the brush pen itself to add in those little lines. And for this one, I did the same thing. I just added a little bit of teal to it. I do end up mixing the teal with the green together right there to get a different color. I still wanted it to be green, but I wanted it to have a hint of teal, so that was another thing that I learned while I was playing around with these, is that you can mix the colors together and come up with a different color, which I know in the watercoloring world is nothing new. People do it all the time. But For me, I was just playing with these and enjoying my time playing with them, and I'm really happy with how these turned out. In a little bit here, you'll see that I get pretty brave and I bring in an even darker teal, and it's called Turtle Green, and I start adding in darker lines there. So then I go back to the very first succulent and get pretty brave and add in more of the dark, which you will see in just a moment. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and leave you with some music to enjoy while I finish up the coloring, and then I'll be back to finish up the bits and pieces of the cards. There are a few tips and tricks that I want to share with you while doing the bits and pieces of the cards, because I did some stamping and embossing and stenciling and all that good stuff so that I could end up with somewhat of a planter look for this card. Anyway, here's some music for you to enjoy, and I'll be back shortly. After I was done with the coloring, I grabbed a piece of Neenah Desert Storm cardstock, as well as the largest die from the Cloudy Frames die set from Pink and Maine. I traced around the inner rectangle and then also traced around the larger bumps so I would know where to line the die back up. And this is I'm kind of doing things in a weird order here, but there is a method to my madness for this. So I grabbed my stamp platform, and I'm going to use the word kind from this little set. This little set is also from Trinity Stamps, and it was part of a promotion, which I wasn't aware that they were having a promotion, so it was a very nice surprise for me when I received it with my order. And I did fussy cut the succulents out. The thing with that is, before you fussy cut them, you want to make sure that they are completely dry. I'm kind of playing with the placement here so I know where to line up the word kind. And then I ink it up with VersaFine Onyx Black ink, because this is a new stamp. I hadn't used it yet, so I'm kind of just seasoning it a bit with the palm of my hand. And I wanted to get a very black impression from this stamp, because I'm going to run this panel through my die cut machine with an embossing folder. And that is why I'm doing the stamping first, and that's also why I traced around the frame, because the only part that's going to be run through with the embossing folder is the rectangle that is cut out. And if you're going to do some embossing, you do want to make sure that you stamp first, because it's very hard to stamp on an embossed image. So once I had that stamped, I put it in my embossing folder. This is a Cuttlebug folder, and I don't know the name of it. I think it might be like Tiny Bubbles or Little Bubbles or something like that. The look that I was going for was kind of like that gravelly look that you often see succulents planted in. Again, I don't have a green thumb. My sister would know what it was called, but the gravel stuff. So I lined up the die and I ran it through my die cut machine. I wanted to add a little bit of color so that the gravel would have different colors in it. I started out with Hickory Smoke Distress Oxide ink, and used a makeup brush just to add a few patches of that here and there. Next, I used Vintage Photo and just continued ink blending, and I'm using a really light hand because I want the ink to stay up on the embossed part of the panel more than get all the way down to the bottom layer. To blend those two colors together a little bit better, I came in with Antique Linen. Then I decided that it needed to be a tad bit darker around the edges, so I came back in with the Vintage Photo and used a little bit of a heavier hand just to really darken up those edges. And then I decided that I need to come back in with the Hickory Smoke, so I just add a little bit more color there. Now, one thing that you'll notice is as I keep adding more and more Distress Oxide ink, the word kind is starting to fade back. And that's because the oxide inks are a hybrid ink, so they have properties of both dye-based and pigment. So it's kind of sitting on top of the stamped word. So to fix that, I just grabbed a brush tip marker and went over those letters to darken them back up. After I did that, I had previously die cut this frame from white cardstock, and I keep my extra pieces in my little pouch that I store my dies. And so I grabbed that out and brought in the English brick wall stencil from My Favorite Things. And then I just added the Vintage Photo and the Hickory Smoke and just randomly added the color just so that there was some variation in the brick and it wasn't all one color. Once I cleaned off my little space there and then removed the die cut from the stencil, the white was way too white. So to tone down the white, I just used Antique Linen oxide ink. And that mellowed out the white just enough, but not too much, and it didn't change the Vintage Photo and the Hickory Smoke very much either. So I was happy with the results of that. Next was to stamp the rest of my sentiment. And these stamps are teeny tiny itty bitty, as you can see. So to make sure that I had them lined up straight, I just, instead of trying to line them up on the cardstock, I actually lined them up on the lid of my stamp platform, and to make sure that there wasn't too much space in between them, I actually had those stamps touching each other on the lid of my stamp platform. I used VersaFine Onyx Black ink to stamp the sentiment, the rest of the sentiment, and then I used one of the fishtail banner dies from Blueprints 27 by My Favorite Things. After I ran that through my die cut machine, I grabbed the Vintage Photo oxide ink and just ran it along the edges just to give it a little bit of separation from everything else. Next, I created a top folding card using the same Desert Storm cardstock and cut a piece of steel gray cardstock down to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8 and adhered that to the front of the card. I placed the cloudy frame die on there just to use as a guide so I could adhere the inner piece flat, because I did want to have the frame raised up so it looked like, to add a little bit of dimension, so it did look like one of those little planter box things. I added a bunch of foam tape to the back of that frame and adhered it down, and then added some foam tape to my sentiment strip and adhered that as well. The last step was to adhere my little succulents. I adhered the small succulent to the bigger succulent just using a tape runner, and then I put foam tape on the back of it so that it would be popped up so it looks like it's sitting above the gravel. I'm going to call it gravel. Added foam tape to the other two succulents, kind of wiggled them around until I was happy with the placement, and then pressed them down. That finishes up my card for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, I'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss a new video when it's posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.